So as I was saying in the previous lecture, more men are viewing cosmetic surgery as a viable way of looking and feeling younger, especially to compete in the workplace. So essentially, this comment raises what may be most interesting from our gender perspective, not which gender is having the surgery, but rather which gender is the one for whom the surgery is being performed. When we think about women and we ask ourselves, who are women trying to impress when they have these types of surgeries? Well, usually they're trying to impress men. Whether it's women's beauty, thinness, breast size, attractiveness, it's all used to attract male partners. For men, on the other hand, and this might be surprising, but the answer is men. And this brings us to this concept of the male gaze, which also comes back to the conversation on penile enlargement not being for women, but it's ultimately to look better in reference to other men. So this idea that men are about the male gaze and feel a need to look big, strong, and virile in front of other men is extremely important in the way that men construct their own gender roles and their own physical manifestations of the gender norms that they're accepting. Friendship, of course, has become feminized, and the intimacy within relationships has become feminized, whereas sex has become masculinized. What this means is that the masculinization of sex includes the pursuit of pleasure for its own sake, the increased attention to orgasm, the multiplication of sexual partners, the universal interest in sexual experimentation, and the separation of sexual behaviors from love. This used to be the way that men did things. But the sexual evolution, the rise of feminism has allowed for women to pursue sexual satisfaction in the same ways that men have. And it's changing the roles and behaviors for men and women within relationships. And what we're seeing in this change is a more of a convergence and an acceptance that men and women are ultimately seeking sexual satisfaction for similar reasons. Those reasons being adventure, pleasure, and emotional expression. Historically, we've seen the social construction of sex as being different for each sex. In fact, the sexual evolution was a rejection of both general social prudishness, or a social discomfort with the disapproval of sex in the first place, and the sexual double standard that prescribed different sexual behaviors for men and women. That double standard was, after all, merely the 19th century version of the interplay theory of gender. Sex was ultimately seen as bad for women, unhealthy, and immoral, whereas it was tolerated and even encouraged for men. This brings up the idea of what actually counts for sex. We see differences within males and females in reference to this. There's certainly inconsistencies among monogamous heterosexual couples. The best example, of course, is Bill Clinton's denial of having sex with Monica Lewinsky. And when he was brought up in front of Congress and run through the impeachment process, he held to the idea that he did not think that he had sex with Monica Lewinsky because there was no penetration. It was only oral sex, and therefore it didn't meet the definitions that Bill Clinton had constructed as what sex actually was. Women tend to see sex in reference to a sexual encounter, which could entail multiple orgasms, whereas men seem to see sex as in reference to each orgasm they have during the act. So whereas one woman might say, well, yeah, I was with him and we had sex, another man might say, well, I was with her and I had sex with her 4 times. They're talking about the same event, but they're just interpreting it in different ways. And as we have seen and read in the chapter, men tend to see orgasm as the defining feature of sex. That brings us, of course, to masturbation. Everybody masturbates, folks. At least most people. I shouldn't say everybody, but most people do. And I found it interesting to see that black men tend to masturbate less than white men and Hispanic men. Hispanic men masturbate more than anybody. And when they're doing that, they're usually creating some sort of fantasy and or are using pornography. Pornography has become very popular in our society, and it has been constructed as both positive and as negative. Certainly has been constructed as negative in reference to the gender roles and norms and how women are presented in pornography. Usually is seen as weak, helpless, and looking for multiple sex partners. You might ask yourself, well, where does all this sexual socialization come from in the first place? Part of it is that we are constantly bombarded with sexual images in the media. So the media is partially responsible for the social construction of gender. But with that being said, we also receive what we know as sexual morality from our parents, our teachers, and our religious institutions. But most of all, most of our sexual learning experience comes from adolescence, and we seek out appropriate gender responses and cues from our peers. We tend to teach ourselves and each other about what feels good and why, and then we practice performing those activities until they feel the way we're told they're supposed to feel. And if we're looking at same-sex peers for validation, then there's a distinct possibility we're going to miss the mark. So if you're confused about sex and what the opposite sex wants, and you ask other boys who are confused about sex and probably don't know what the opposite sex wants, then there's a distinct possibility you're going to get it wrong. And there's plenty of evidence that males are consistently getting it wrong. So once we socially construct what sex is supposed to be with our peers, then we have to figure out how to do it. And we see differences between boys and girls in reference to pursuing what we would call unwanted sexual encounters. 33% of boys engaged in unwanted sexual encounters to gain experience, whereas 11% of girls did that. And another way of looking at it is 18% of boys sought unwanted sexual encounters in order to not appear shy, gay, or afraid, whereas 4% of girls did that. And that really leads us down this idea or this road of sexual dysfunction in men and women. And what we really know sexual dysfunction to be is it's not a physical dysfunction normally. It's more about gender socialization and the desire to conform, as well as it's being about dysfunctional bodies. As we talked earlier about this idea of convergence and with the rise of feminism, we saw and we are seeing the closing of the sexual gender gap. The sexual revolution created ideological shifts in how men and women conducted or constructed their gender identities. And it's really not that it created ideological shifts for both sexes. Women just started moving away from the traditional social construction of women as being asexual and not interested in sex to being more like males, where they were having where they were engaging in sexual pleasure for its own sake, whether that meant masturbation or promiscuous sex. Women started to behave more like males. As I mentioned, feminism made the pursuit of sexual pleasure a political goal in and of itself. So if women were pursuing a sexual identity, they were doing it as a form of social resistance. And ultimately, they were taking over and creating their own sexual agency.